Hello and welcome to climatedebate.co.uk. I'm going to be talking about the thinking that's at the centre of our guide to the climate debate, which is this map or diagram showing the structure of the climate debate. And this map is clickable, so you can click on any of the entities and it'll take you through to the article, or you can click on one of the bigger boxes, which is a category, and that will take you through to the category page. So this map lays out the structure of the climate debate, and we've put in each category a number of entities, a number of claims that you'll find in the climate debate. These categories aren't exhaustive. At the moment, they're just illustrative, but we will be adding more and more to them in the category pages, but not necessarily put them in the diagram. So the diagram here is just illustrative for the moment. Our intention here is to steelman the argument as opposed to straw man the debate. We're not trying to debunk anything as such here. What we're trying to do is demonstrate that there is a logical progression between global warming science as such and climate policy, and that we can take issue at any point in that progression and make up our own minds about how strong the evidence is and how good the science is. So why is this important? Well, often the debate is presented as a single claim, climate change is real, and that people who are skeptical of climate science or climate policy disagree with that claim. But actually what we can see here is something far more complicated. There are a constellation of claims in these categories, each of which may or may not be true on their own, whether or not climate change is happening, or whether or not global warming is anthropogenic, and we should be able to treat them as independent claims and not be put off by the political framing of the debate. So there are 5 categories here, starting with global warming. And actually, global warming is not a very controversial category of claim. Most people who are called skeptics or even called climate change deniers agree that CO2 is a greenhouse gas and that we're putting a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere, which is likely to cause warming. Where the controversy begins is in the discussion about the role of climate feedbacks. So, for example, people with very alarmist perspectives believe that positive feedbacks will amplify anthropogenic global warming, whereas there in fact is a debate about the net balance of positive and net negative feedbacks. Global warming moves into climate change, of course, and there is a mixture of evidence here. Some of it's very reasonable, such as the IPCC points out that a warmer atmosphere is capable of holding more moisture, and that therefore we can expect more precipitation or rainfall to occur in the future. And there is a little graph there showing that globally there appears to be more rainfall than there used to be. But when we move to central England, which is a very rainy place, or relatively rainy place, we don't see so much evidence of a radical increase in rainfall. In fact, we see no trend at all. And then back in the climate change category, we see slightly less reasonable claims, such as the claim that global warming is going to increase the frequency and intensity of storms. And in fact, when we look at the evidence or when the data is shown, we see that there is no evidence of an increase in hurricane frequency or intensity. That's not to say that there won't be an increase in the future, but that so far that increase is not visible in the data. And then we move from climate change into the category of climate impacts. So these are the nth order effects of global warming that we should be able to see in the world. And this is where we begin to really see ideology influencing people's understanding of climate change or the effects of climate change. So, for example, there is maybe reasonable evidence that sea level rise will be caused by glacial recession and ice sheet loss, not sea ice loss, be careful to point out, but glacial recession and sea ice loss may increase the rate of sea level rise. But in claims such as that climate change will increase flooding, this turns out not to be quite such a safe claim, because, as the IPCC points out, flooding is actually quite a complicated phenomenon, and it's not the case that increased amounts of rainfall causes increased numbers of floods. Floods are often caused by things such as poor policy decisions, poor planning decisions, and the failure of civil infrastructure. So, as it turns out, we see fewer and fewer people over the last few decades experiencing flooding. That's making the point that flooding is not a meteorological phenomenon as such. So climate impacts moves into this category of climate crisis, and this is the category of claims that animates the likes of the very unreasonable and somewhat ridiculous protest movements that block roads and so on. And this is where we begin to see very little evidence underpinning these claims. So, for example, the claim that's been around for a long time that climate change is increasing the number of diseases in the world, or increasing the effect of diseases in the world, it just simply turns out to have no evidence. And in fact, communicable diseases are on something of a radical decline compared to just a few decades ago. So we're really not seeing the evidence there. Or we might want to look at the claims that climate change is causing a decline in agricultural productivity. And again, it turns out that in most parts of the world, in fact, all parts of the world, agricultural productivity is not in any kind of serious decline. On the contrary, many countries, even in the poorest parts of the world, are getting better at producing their own food. So there's very little evidence in the climate crisis category, but it is the climate crisis category which lends itself most to demands for climate policy. And we see here as well very little evidence that climate policy is even achieving very much on its own terms, and quite a lot of evidence that actually climate policy is extremely harmful, which is, of course, why we've produced this website. We believe that climate policy is inherently harmful. So all of these claims are also joined up by modelling. I won't go into too much detail about how these are connected, but we can see, for example, that the link between global warming and climate change is often made using computer models, computer simulations, by comparing the outputs of two different simulations with different levels of CO2 in order to make the claim that climate change can be attributed to anthropogenic global warming, and similarly with these impacts, which are often driven by unrealistic assumptions. And as we've discussed, climate crisis doesn't have any very good observational evidence underpinning it. Most of the evidence that are used to support claims that there is a climate crisis comes from climate modelling. So, for example, lots of people who involved in climate activism are extremely confused when you point out that there is no evidence of infectious diseases or agricultural productivity decline or poverty or conflict growing in the global warming era, because they believe that's what the science says. But it's not observational science, it's modelling science, it's modelling studies that makes the claim that all of these things are happening. And that needs to be explained to people. Often some of them are scientists. One final thing we might want to observe is that as you move from global warming through to climate policy, scientific certainty diminishes. And that's probably as a result of increasing dependence on climate models, because or models of different kinds, because all of these models are plugged into each other, and then they create an unstable structure and an ever weakening argument. And error has a tendency to cascade through such structures because they aren't very often tested in reality. Often these claims aren't tested through observations of the real world. So there you have it. That's our map of the climate debate. I hope you find it useful. Please let us know what you think.